While modern-day wrestling has gradually seen less and less of a focus being placed on giants like we saw in the 80s, that's not to say that there's not a spot for a good big man whenever he comes along. And in the last few years, few of those big men have been able to make more of an impact than Braun Strowman. Yes, despite only really getting started within the last half-decade, the country-strong Southern boy has already left a legacy that's seen him rise to the very top of the main event scene in the WWE, winning the Universal title and at points seeming primed to become their next big star. And while recent events may have thrown a spanner in these plans, it seems like the big man has some big plans in the near future. But what are these plans? And how did he get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in Monster Among Men, The Braun Strowman Story. Adam Scherr was born on September 6, 1983 in Sherrills Ford, North Carolina to parents Rick and Sarah, the former of whom was, by the time Adam was born, already widely regarded to be one of the greatest slow-pitch softball players in the world. So with his family pedigree weighing heavily on both he and his sister Hannah's shoulders then, the youngster would seek to make a name for himself in sports too from an early age, with him getting heavily involved in his football, track and field, and amateur wrestling while studying at Bandy's High School. And of course, with his massive figure, one that had already seen him reach 6'5" by his freshman year, Adam would find this all fairly easy. So easy was it in fact that, despite all the success he was having, after he graduated in 2001, the youngster started doing what he himself described as goofing off for a couple of years, looking for anything that might present a real challenge to him. Luckily then he would find this when, after enrolling in community college in 2003, he started playing football semi-professionally, there discovering a level of athlete that could match up to his skills as he became a star member of the Hickory Hornets. On top of that, the Carolina boy would supplement his income around this time by working as both a doorman and a mechanic, with this being enough to satisfy him for a while. Ultimately though, by the late 2000s, he would have reached as far as he was going to in the semi-pros, and so at that point, he was forced to decide what he was going to do next with his career. And given that by then he had grown to an absolutely massive 6'8" in height and 385 pounds in weight, Adam decided that the best thing for him to do going forward would be to put his body to the test by taking part in strongman competitions. And this, as it turned out, ended up being a hugely successful endeavor for him, as in 2010 and 2011, he would place first in the Europa Battle of Champions, Monster of the Midland, Central Georgia Strongest Man, Summerfest Strongman, and West Cary Fall Festival of Power tournaments, as well as also winning the NAS Amateur National Championships too. But that wouldn't be his greatest achievement as a strongman, however, as in 2012, he would enter the Arnold Amateur Strongman Championship, there placing first as he from there booked himself in a spot in the famed Arnold Strongman Classic the following year. And when the time for that event came, Adam would once again face off against the best in the world, standing toe-to-toe with each of them and finishing an impressive 10th overall in the end. Still, despite all his success here, by then, the country-strong Carolinian was beginning to realize that, unless you were one of the absolute top names in the world, it was hard to actually make a good living off of strongman competitions. That was why, after he'd been scouted by former Olympic powerlifter and WWE superstar Mark Henry in early 2013, he decided to try out his luck in the world of pro wrestling instead, hoping that he could find a spot for himself there as Vince McMahon's next big giant. And so, reporting to the WWE Performance Center in Orlando, Florida later that year then, Adam would make it his goal to become as good as possible as quickly as possible. And of course, seeing the potential star they had on their hands right away, WWE officials would give him everything he needed to succeed in this goal, putting him through a rigorous training regime, all while rechristening him as Braun Strowman, the Monster Among Men. And impressed with his quick progress from there, the company would soon start to prepare him for a full-blown in-ring role, with Vince McMahon deciding that it was best to fast-track him past NXT and move him straight up to the main roster instead. That was how, after a cameo appearance as one of Adam Rose's Rosebuds and a solitary showing during an NXT live event in late 2014, Strowman would make his debut during a main event dark match on June 2nd of the following year. And happy with how the crowd was responding to him there, McMahon rocketed him up to a main event level spot soon after when, on the August 24, 2015 episode of Raw, the Rookie was introduced as the newest member of the Wyatt family, with him now having the slightly altered name of Braun Strowman, as he made an impressive statement by laying waste to both Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose of The Shield. After that, Braun would have his first televised singles match the following week when he took on Ambrose one-on-one, there defeating the Lunatic Fringe via disqualification and looking like a true beast in the process to the audience watching in attendance. Yes, it seemed like the newcomer was becoming a quick hit with both management and fans at this time, and many already saw a lot of potential in his future. Sure, he wasn't much of a wrestler yet, and maybe he could have done with a couple more years in developmental so as to iron out those kinks in his game, but that aside, his presence was largely enough to overcome this as, from there, he would regularly compete in multi-man matches alongside his Wyatt cohorts over the next few months, helping them to defeat the likes of The Shield and a collective of ECW originals. Come January of 2016, though, Braun would get his next real test when he was entered into that year's Royal Rumble match, with him getting to play the monster role here as he eliminated 5 people and even got to stand toe-to-toe with Brock Lesnar for a while. Yes, if it wasn't already clear before, by now it was obvious to everyone that Vince McMahon was fast-tracking his new favorite toy straight to the top. And this rise would only continue in the months that followed as he continued to stand by the Wyatt family's side and play their equivalent of the Incredible Hulk. That would all change come the 2016 draft, however, as it was at this point that, feeling that it was time to let Braun fly solo, the boss had him moved over to Raw, with this separating him from his stablemates as, for the first time in his main roster career, he was presented as a full-blown single star. And despite concerns some may have had about it being too early to make such a move for the rookie, Braun proved them all wrong when he became an instant hit as a solo star, mowing through a number of jobbers during his early weeks on the Red brand as he staked his claim to being the biggest and baddest performer out there. But of course, with claims of greatness such as these, there are always going to be those who disagree, and that was why, come September of that year, Braun would meet his first real challenger in the form of Sin Cara, someone who felt that the monster among men wasn't as good as he said he was and wanted to show him just how true this statement was by taking him on in the ring. When the time for that match came, however, the big man would make short work of his opponent, proving that he really had been that dominant all along. And after this, he would continue to build momentum when he won a Battle Royal on the October 31st episode of Raw so as to earn himself a spot on Team Raw during the 5-on-5 elimination match at the following month's Survivor Series. After putting on a good showing there then, the Carolinian would enter into a program with Sami Zayn, which saw both men face off at December 18th's Roadblock End of the Line, with the stipulation here being that Braun only had 10 minutes with which to defeat Zayn, otherwise the whole thing would be labeled a draw. And despite pummeling him for those 10 minutes, in the end, Sami was able to survive the onslaught that night, something which only served to anger the Giant as, from there, he began campaigning to Raw general manager Mick Foley to be given a rematch, something which he would eventually get on the January 2nd, 2017 episode of the Red brand, where finally, he was able to put the Canadian down once and for all in a last man standing match. So, moving from one Canadian to another after that, Braun would next start a feud with Kevin Owens, challenging him for his Universal title on the January 30th episode of Raw. And although he would win that match, it would only end up being by disqualification, so the big man would not be able to take home the brand's top prize on that particular night. Still, holding his own in such a spot proved that he was developing faster than anyone could have hoped for, and that McMahon appeared to have been right about placing him in such a high-profile position so early on in his career after all. And proving this even further, Strowman would continue to impress going forward when he faced off against Roman Reigns at the following month's Fastlane pay-per-view, there taking his first pinfall loss as he helped to get the big dog ready for his WrestleMania 33 match against The Undertaker. After WrestleMania was done with, though, the monster among men would get to continue his feud with Reigns, with this seeing him actually start to get some babyface reactions for the first time, as by then, Roman had become so hated by audiences that anyone who went up against him instantly became a hero. So using these positive reactions to push him harder then, Braun was able to get his win back over the big dog at April 30th, 2017's Payback. Sadly though, any hopes that this would shoot him back into the world title picture were stalled when, on the May 8th episode of Raw, the big man suffered a shattered elbow, with this putting him out of action for the next 2 months and forcing the company to have to cancel his planned match with Brock Lesnar at July's Great Balls of Fire. Yes, it was an unfortunate bump in the road, but the Carolinian didn't let it get him down for too long as, upon his return later that summer, he would defeat Roman Reigns once again, this time in an ambulance match, all before finally getting to face off against the Beast over the Universal title at August 20th SummerSlam, with this match taking the form of a fatal four-way that also included Samoa Joe and the Big Dog himself. And despite coming out on the losing end that night, Strowman would put on such a show-stealing performance that he would get a one-on-one rematch against the Beast at the following month's No Mercy pay-per-view, with this being the point where many fans and industry insiders believed it was finally time to pull the trigger on the big man and give him a run as the champion. Yes, by now, Braun had become so over that even people who had been detractors of his before were now firmly jumping on board the Strowman train. That was why it felt so disappointing then when, as the time for this match came, the challenger would lose once more, with this firmly setting him in many fans' eyes as someone who just couldn't get the job done. Still, even if his aura did start to fade somewhat around this time, Braun still remained a star, and he would continue to maintain that stardom as, heading into December, he got involved in The Miz's feud with the recently reformed Shield, there teaming up with a heel unit made up of himself, The Miz, The Bar, and Kane as they took on the Hounds of Justice and their one-night honorary member Kurt Angle at tables, ladders, and chairs. What many didn't expect to happen on that night, however, was that, after being turned on by his teammates, the Monster Among Men would turn babyface for the first time in his career, with him solidifying this shift the next night on Raw by completely destroying the Miztourage. And so now, on the side of the good guys, Braun would get a fresh batch of opponents to face. Opponents that included the likes of the Big Red Machine, who he would start feuding with heading into the new year. And this feud would even see the two get a shot at Brock Lesnar's Universal title during a triple threat match at the 2018 Royal Rumble. Still though, even with his new alignment revitalizing him in the eyes of many fans, he still couldn't get the job done when the time for this bout came. And to make matters worse, the next month at Elimination Chamber, he would fail to win that titular match too, there falling to Roman Reigns by the end as the Big Dog booked his ticket to the main event at WrestleMania 34. So now, being forced to try and pick himself up once more, the Carolina boy started leaning into the more child-friendly aspects of his character when he single-handedly won a battle royal to make himself the #1 contender to the Bar's Raw Tag Team titles then, from there, started introducing audiences to his new tag partner, Braun Strowman, basically just him in a set of glasses. Unfortunately though, WWE would not accept this as a valid partner for the big match, and so, when the time for this came at WrestleMania 34 on April 8th, he would handpick one out of the audience instead, eventually settling on a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas, who was in truth the son of referee John Cone. And so, with Nicholas by his side then, Braun would go on to win the tag team titles that night, giving fans a nice feel-good moment, all before the youngster decided to vacate the belts the next night on Raw, as defending them would have interfered with his schoolwork too much. Yes, it was during this period where the Monster Among Men had turned into a full-blown live-action Looney Tunes character, frequently performing cartoonish antics such as single-handedly lifting a semi-truck off the ground, tipping over an ambulance, taking part in a comedy tag team with Alexa Bliss, or stopping mid-rampage through the backstage catering area so as to eat a piece of delicious chocolate cake. And this new direction was eventually enough to revitalize him once again in both fans and the company's eyes, as from there he broke the record for the most Royal Rumble eliminations during a single match with 13 at the Saudi Arabia show The Greatest Royal Rumble on April 27th of that year. And after that, he would spend the rest of the spring and summer being the absolute bane of Kevin Owens' life, with him frequently laying waste to the Canadian here, and eventually even stealing his Money in the Bank contract away from him after defeating him at August 19th SummerSlam. So now, with a title shot that he could cash in at any time of his choosing, he turned heel once more as he began feuding with the then Universal Champion Roman Reigns heading into the autumn. But while being back in a main event title program had certainly boosted his reputation again, the switching between alignments right when he was arguably at his hottest as a babyface ultimately did more to harm him than anything else as, from there, he would begin to falter once more, eventually failing on his cash-in attempt at October's Hell in a Cell after an interference spot from Brock Lesnar caused the whole thing to be deemed a no contest. So trying to save his momentum, WWE quickly turned him babyface again once the feud with Roman was over. This, however, just left fans feeling even more cold, as by then, the constant flip-flopping had begun to turn them off altogether. As a consequence of this then, he would mill about in a seemingly endless feud with Baron Corbin leading into 2019, and at WrestleMania 35, he would be relegated to a spot in the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, taking him right back to where he'd been 2 years prior. Following this, and he would feud with Bobby Lashley for a while, all before starting a short-lived tag team with then Universal Champion Seth Rollins. And of course, this partnership would eventually see the two babyfaces, who at one point would even defeat the Good Brothers to become Raw Tag Team Champions together, want to see who the better man really was. That was why, at September 15th's Clash of Champions, they would pull double duty, defending their tag titles against Dolph Ziggler and Robert Roode early on in the night, all before returning to face off against each other for the brand's top prize in the main event. Sadly though, not only would Braun end up losing his tag titles on that night, he would also once again fail to become Universal Champion too, with it seeming very much by now like he was never going to reach the top of the mountain after all. Still though, even if the company didn't want to give him the strap, they did still see him as a big draw, and so, when two-time World Heavyweight Boxing Champion Tyson Fury got involved with WWE in October of that year, it would be the Carolinian who would be selected to be his opponent, with the two eventually facing off at October 31st's Crown Jewel in a losing effort for the big man. After that, he would be drafted over to SmackDown, where he would kick off 2020 by defeating Shinsuke Nakamura to win the Intercontinental title for the first time in his career, and then from there, in April, he would get an unexpected opportunity after Roman Reigns pulled himself from his Universal title match with Goldberg at WrestleMania 36, with this forcing the company to have to scramble to find a last-minute replacement. And of course, that replacement would end up being Braun, who in an empty performance center on March 25th would now, finally, get to reach his potential when he beat the WCW legend to win the top prize on the brand towards the close of the show. Sadly though, for many fans, this came as too little too late. And it certainly didn't help that for the entirety of his run from there, the new champion would be forced to perform in front of empty arenas, getting caught up in an increasingly silly program with The Fiend that many believed killed whatever momentum he had left. And things would get even worse when, after turning heel once again and losing his title at August 23rd's SummerSlam, Roman Reigns would return from his hiatus with a brand new heel character, completely wiping out any need for another top villain on the brand at that time, as from there on in, he would be dominating SmackDown. So desperately wanting to maintain his relevance, Strowman would be drafted back over to the Red brand once more, as from there, he took part in Shane McMahon's Raw Underground for a while, all before entering into a feud with Keith Lee. Following this, and he would mill around in the upper mid-card for a while, having a number of go-nowhere matches up until the point that he started a WrestleMania program with Shane McMahon at the beginning of 2021. And this would see the two face off at the Showcase of the Immortals that April in a steel cage match as it happened, with the big man ultimately coming out the victor here. Still, by then, he was no longer the only monster in the yard, and, as time went on, it looked increasingly like he was being usurped by the likes of Omos or Commander Aziz. Maybe that's why it shouldn't have come as a surprise then when, on June 2nd of that year, he would be part of a wave of mass releases from WWE, with his exit probably being the most high-profile one outside of his former partner Bray Wyatt. Yes, while many fans still believed he could have been something special if booked right, it was clear that by then, Vince McMahon had moved on to his new toys, so now, having to seek out alternative employment, Braun would be forced to take stock of the wrestling landscape and decide what he was going to do next. And this move eventually would see him appear at EC3's Free the Narrative 2 Monsters in Us All event on October 2nd. This all before he would debut for Ring of Honor just 1 month later under his new name of the Titan. But with ROH's future looking unsure at the moment, and the likes of AEW and New Japan seeming to be out of reach for him right now, it remains to be seen where Strowman's future lies going forward. Judging by recent social media posts from Braun, EC3, and Killer Kross, it looks like the three of them certainly have something up their sleeves. Maybe they'll start a new promotion of their own. However, if this doesn't happen, we wouldn't be surprised if he ended up going back to WWE at some point, as his style seems so perfectly suited to them that it would feel like madness for Vince McMahon to not try capitalizing on him again before it's all said and done. We just hope that if and when this does happen, the boss decides to pull the trigger on him when the time is right this time, as, if he plays his cards right, the monster among men could still be a pillar of the company going into the rest of the decade. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.